thank everyone for joining us. We're really excited to be here. And what we'll do today, we're having a fireside chat. This is a very informal conversation, maybe compared to some of the other sessions you've been in. We won't have any slides or written materials to look at, but really a conversation of some experts today about collaboration and partnerships, which is obviously the theme of the event today. But as we get started, I wanted first to introduce myself, and we'll set the stage a little bit about what collaboration means, and introduce our fabulous participants here in our panel, and introduce their work just a little bit. And we'll have some structured questions, a little dialogue with the three of them. And then at the end of the session, we'll turn it over to all of you to ask some questions, and to enter into dialogue with the group as well. So please, as you enter into the room, bring up your chat window to the side of the Microsoft Teams window, and feel free to ask questions throughout the discussion, and we'll get to those toward the end of the day, or the end of the hour rather, and go back and forth and try to get you involved in the conversation as well. And then at the end, we'll actually give you a way to extend the conversation beyond this hour if you'd like to join us virtually offline for further discussion. So that said, a little bit about myself. My name is Michael Downey. I work for the Digital Impact Alliance, where I'm their Director of Community, responsible for several different programs that we run that's about empowering communities and helping to strengthen their work together. One of the things that we do that many of you have heard of is the Principles for Digital Development, but we also have some other programs that reach well over 1,200 people, over 300 or so organizations. So DIAL is very big in building communities and strengthening their work together to collaborate and to partner across lots of different work. So I'm obviously very interested in this topic. One of the things that you may not have heard of that we do in addition to the Principles for Digital Development is a podcast called Pulse on the Principles, which started last year. And it's a way to take the digital principles from a kind of set of guidance and a set of topics that are out there to really integrate that into our daily work and how we think about the problems that we each handle in our jobs and in our work. So we're really excited to use this hour as almost a live podcast of sorts as we interview several of our participants. And I'll introduce them to you now. And after I give their backgrounds, I want to ask each of them kind of a guiding question to open up the dialogue. But first, we have Nora Lindstrom from PLAN and also on the Digital Principles Advisory Committee. Nora has over a decade of experience over, I think, 3 different continents. But right now, she's currently the global lead for digital development at PLAN International, and she's really focused on responding
I think we just need to upgrade Michael to a presenter again. Okay, well, in the interim, I'll take over and introduce myself. Just briefly to say that so with PLAN, I promote the responsible use of technology as well as drive our work on the digital empowerment of girls. And as Michael mentioned, I sit on the Digital Principles Advisory Council and have been on it for the past 2 years. And with that, I'll hand over to Nanjira, who can introduce herself, I think.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Nanjira Sambuli. Among other things, I have the great pleasure of serving on the board of DIAL, and it's really exciting to be able to join you this evening on my side of the world. So greetings from Nairobi.
Thank you, Nanjera. I'm just going to hop in. So I'm Claudine Lim. I'm the manager for the digital principles at Dial. So I'm just going to then pass it over to Peter, who can now introduce himself before we get started.
Hello, everyone. My name is Peter, and based in Nairobi. And I work for Finnish development NGOs, FINGO, umbrella organization for Finnish organizations based in Nairobi. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. So this panel today, like we've been promoting, is made up of key stakeholders in our digital principle community, from Dial board members to advisory council to Peter, who's been super involved with the digital principles over the past few years. So now that you've been introduced to all of them, I'm just going to start off with a kickoff question just to get us all sort of warmed up and just to get the conversation going. And Nanjera, I'm actually going to start with you. So what do you think is the most important thing that organizations like Dial can do to improve the impact of partnerships in development?
In some, I would say it's really walking the talk. I feel like we've reached a point in the digital development sector where we've created and curated a set of principles, a set of good practices, if you will, that give us the guardrails of what needs to happen. Now it's actually starting to do the work. So for example, when it comes to partnerships and, to the title of a session on being collaborative, it's really now doubling down on figuring out what that means. At what step do you speak to whom? How do you factor who's not been incorporated in decision making? And how do you leave that sort of or create that awareness to make sure that even if we're in a rush, for example, to address something, say like the pandemic, and coalescing our resources to start addressing that just because we want to move fast, and this tends to be a thing, we'll move fast, and then the risk is that we might break things and break societies because we've not taken the time to actually figure out, is that what needs to happen in a community? Is that what the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries or end users, those passive terms we've previously used to discuss people on the other side of it, is this what they want? Is this what they have articulated for themselves as the need? Have you actually cultivated trust with these communities to actually hear their honest opinions about what's not working in development? And I think that's a really, really important element that needs to start coming in a lot more. We're still in a phase where in development and in digital or ICT4 development, you still have the top-down parachuting in dynamic, whether it's from capitals to the, say rural areas, or from the west to the south, whatever you want to call it. And that gap needs to start being closed. So in some, as I said, it's really starting to walk the talk, because I think we always risk sometimes getting to a point of pointing this stuff out and fetishizing it and having nice sound bites. But I think it's time, to lay bare the fact that we need to start stepping in, and that's the most important thing anyone can bring to strengthening partnerships.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of important points there. Process is more important than solution. Just being really thoughtful about what we do might take longer, but that's how you really build up sustainability. And I think that the same can be said about, users. Building that trust in relationships is also a process. It's not just we interviewed some people and this is what they told us. It's really, a long-term sustainable relationship where you can start having those honest conversations. So thank you, Nanjera. Before I move on to the next question, I just wanted to check to see if Michael was back, if he was able to.
Hi, everyone. I apologize. We had a brief power cut here and the internet went down for a moment. Many of us can relate to that. But I am back. Can you all give me a thumbs up to hear me, that you can hear me okay? Great. And thank you, Claude, for stepping in. And Nanjera, thank you for that really valuable reminder that it's important to walk the talk. It's easy to say, but often more challenging to do in practice, which I think is what we might like to get to today. Similar question, maybe Nora, for you and your role with the digital principles and the advisory committee. The principles are designed to be practical advice for people to really, put some of these ideas into practice. What would you say, just offer to people as, one easy way to leverage one or more of those digital principles into building those everyday partnerships with other organizations? Are there certain principles that maybe stand out to you as more accessible than others to get started with?
Yeah, so so one of my favorite principles is reuse and improve, because I think, you know, it really seeks to sort of minimize the reinvention of the wheel and sort of inefficiencies and pilotitis and also, tech-enabled projects is failing for really predictable reasons, right? Like stuff that we know doesn't work, and so reuse and improve to me is really all about sort of sharing and partnering, and I mean, in other words, sort of being collaborative, which of course is another digital principle as well. And so for me, like, be collaborative and reuse and improve are sort of really a really good starting point for digital development generally, but also for partnerships in particular, because we need to share each other's work, including our failings, and then learn from others and build on each other's work, right? So it's, in a way, actors in international development are in a way competitors, right? Because we seek the same funding a lot of the time. So I think that, like, appealing to the principles of reuse and improve and be collaborative can be really helpful for advancing partnerships. And I think that that's also something that, one would hope that donors would take on board a bit more, in that it not having these calls for funding that are like, the most innovative new thing, but actually how can we build on what's there and reuse and improve. And another sort of maybe more practical kind of way that I find that the principles can be helpful is as a common starting point. So, working for a big INGO as I am, we're often looking for new partners or vendors to implement, this or that work. And if I know that agency that we're contracting to do something has endorsed the principles, then I know that at least, in theory, we should have a similar approach to things. And I think that that's at a really practical level in your sort of procurement or when you're going for bids and when you're partner, to look, have they endorsed the principles? And then you know that you can expect a certain standard, if you like. So those would be my thoughts on that.
No, really good points. And I think, integrating the principles into our daily work is something that we can continually strive to do. And I think hearing from other people and how they've done that in their own work is a really great way to, again, use the principles themselves and reuse and improve upon their own ways to integrate them. Peter, a quick question for you, and I know you've done work there locally in Kenya, looking at implementation work. I'm wondering what you've seen in your research and your direct everyday work as really maybe one biggest challenge. Obviously, there are many challenges, but what's one biggest challenge in creating more local leadership in digital development projects? And do you see kind of common systems or processes that are maybe holding that back from happening more frequently?
Thank you, Michael. I think looking at that from two perspectives in terms of general development work and in terms of principles as well, I think one of the things that come to my mind is the aspect of being consciously aware and actively using existing structures and forums within the country, where these structures and forums both entrench a lot of local leadership and champions within these structures. And for example, picking up a structure, for example, the SDG Forum in Kenya, which brings close to over 300 civil society organizations, that provides a massive entry point for both, particularly looking at the work being done around principles for digital development. And this will provide a great entry point, for example, for in-country work for Digital Principles Advisory Council, and then leave that and throw that back to working groups within such forums. So for me, that appears to be a low-lying fruit. The other thing is identifying the right entry point from the government side. We know generally as a principle, civil society organizations, NGOs, are basically complementing what the government ought to be doing as the duty bearer. So it's, again, being very conscious and actively doing it and involving the government and the appropriate government bodies and ministries and departments while developing solutions around development work. This is not necessarily for these departments to be involved in day-to-day or implementation, but even making them aware of the work that is going on. And these two aspects can actually create a major bottleneck and aware on the background by not involving the government, and as well not using existing structures and forums within countries.
Now, those are very excellent points, and I want to come back to those a little bit later. We'll be talking a little bit more about a vision of what it looks like when we have more country-led partnerships. I think it's important to keep that in mind as our end goal here. But I want to go back maybe to the first thing you said and open it up to the group, to all three of you now, and talk a little bit more about what do you think really holds people or organizations back when it comes to building meaningful collaboration with others on a day-to-day basis. It's one thing to do a contract with a partner in a large project in a very formal way, but there's a lot of opportunity for smaller scale partnerships and collaboration just in our day-to-day work and finding common interests and things that we can share information about, share strategy, and really be more coordinated from. So the question for all of you now is, what do you think are the major factors that are holding people back from doing that? And is it something that we should tackle maybe from the bottom up, individual level versus top down with policy changes? Anyone have strong opinions there or things that have really jumped out to them as challenges that have been really difficult to overcome? Maybe Nanjira, I'll open it to you, and I'll kind of phrase it. I'll phrase it in maybe this idea of Dial's new strategy that came out earlier this month, and it's really kind of an evolution from just investing in individual sectors, which is very classical in a traditional kind of way of doing things, to, as I think it's maybe best described as linking the digital technology, the platforms that are out there, to policies in a very holistic and coordinated way. Obviously, partnerships are really important at doing that. You can set policies and large scale directives of that we need to work together. What would you see that looking like from the bottom up, from day-to-day work in terms of building out solutions in a coordinated way with other organizations?
I'll go back to first the very initial way you framed it, and I think you've in your follow-up it's come out the siloed nature of how we've had to work in the past, and I think even everything from how organizations are structured to the resources that are available. So you can find, for example, that maybe a civil society network has strong, groundwork, if you will, but is not adequately resourced to do more collaborative work. And then typically what will happen is somebody else will come in with a new coalition with more funding, typically parachuting in from somewhere, and then sort of pick their brains as opposed to actually giving those who actually are experts in the work to do that. So resourcing has put us in a very unfortunate, the style of resourcing from philanthropy, development cooperation, and elsewhere, in pitting people in a competitive rather than collaborative setting. If, say, German development versus British development versus US development versus UN development bodies all want to work on digital transformation in a country like Kenya, but when they approach the same actors on the ground, and each of them is coming with their own strategy, and this is something that's been happening too. Everybody has a new digital strategy, but it's very set in a particular way. So sure, maybe they consulted with stakeholders and in putting it together, but there's always something about the lack of adaptiveness to the fact that how do we make sure, especially from the top down, that there's that responsibility, that duty even we must extend to those coming in with the resources to find a way to sync their efforts all together, so that if somebody, and this is, let me actually even give a very practical thing when it gets very real on the ground, is everybody wants to fund the programming, but no one wants to fund operations. So there's very tricky for actors to then say we'll collaborate or complement one another's work. And this is a practical bottom area. So to your question of what needs to happen, I feel like, folks on the ground, if you want to call it that, have spoken back to this over and over and over again. The question is, what is it that's so scary about the top-down actors or those at the top that they cannot see? And I hope this pandemic helps people realize there's really nothing to benefit from each of us coming in with our own siloed approach. There's a responsibility, I think, maybe it's a principle specific or a calibration of the principles for those financing development to find a way that to have collaborative approaches across their way of financing and structuring what resources come to the ground. Then we can start seeing a trickle down to how even those on the ground are able to even not just collaborate, but also complement each other's efforts.
No, that's very true, and I think people have been calling for this for a long time, and feeling a lot of frustration because I'm reminded actually the materials on the Digital Principles website about the principle called Be Collaborative really sets it apart from all of the other principles that are listed out there right now, saying this really wraps everything up comprehensively, and it's very important, and it's called out there that it's important to realize that there's overhead involved in collaboration, and there's an intrinsic cost to doing that in terms of time and communication, and maybe it slows you down a little bit from running off on your own, but overall the reward is much richer than you could get by acting alone. I'll misquote the old Kenyan phrase of if you want to go far, go together, right? And we've got to do that in order to really achieve this large grand vision that we all have of making the world better. It's something that we can't reasonably do independently on our own. So maybe Nora, I'll switch it over to you, and given your role on the Principals Council.
Can I comment on that though? On that
please.
Previous conversation before we move on, because I think when we're talking about partnerships and collaborations, I really think that, a central thing we need to talk about is power and significantly unequal power and power relationships. And, you mentioned the principle of Be Collaborative, which I've just said that, I think is a really important one as well. But I was reviewing some of the materials on the Principles website, and I didn't spot a single mention of power relations or power dynamics. Now, I did a relatively quick scan, so it might be there, but it's not central in Be Collaborative. How do we talk about power in our collaborations? And I think that if we want our collaborations to be true and our partnerships to be successful, we can't shy away from talking about power and talking about privilege as well. And these are difficult conversations, but I also think that these are ones that, the international development community really needs to have more broadly, but then also when it comes to sort of tech-enabled programming in particular, I think we need to be very, very conscious of power, because technology in itself isn't neutral. And so by introducing technology, we're also introducing inequalities, given that there's some really fundamental sort of digital divides that exist. So I would like to see us to have more frank conversations about power. And this links to, what Nanjira was saying about resourcing. I mean, that's also a question of power and how that resourcing is distributed and so on. So I would really encourage us to try to get that more, center that much more into our discussions on collaboration and partnerships.
Nora, I want to just jump in, tag on exactly what you're saying, and just add a quick one. Why I actually specifically refrain from using the language of power is because typically what happens in our sector is then we have workshops about power relations and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we lose the track of what it is. And you've seen this, it's really becoming a frustrating thing where the language is becoming from the ground up, if you want to call it that, around decolonizing everything, right? Decolonizing structures in development or elsewhere. That has already been sort of like captured by actors who are taking it and then sort of spinning it around. And so I've started to realize, how do we use what we already have? We may not call it out as power just because people will name check it, but make sure that what you're speaking to, how do we have that in principles, or rather writing of these principles, because without that language being captured. And I feel like we have a duty to protect that language of power, of struggle, of colonizing and decolonizing for those who are really trying to use it as the new vocab to bring to bear new issues, and not for all of us to now start running off to do new workshops about checking out power relations and other farces that we've seen.
Maybe just quickly and away from the power and going back to where Nigeria started on siloed working, I think one other thing is lack of thinking other approaches alongside principles for digital development and identifying how they link and complement each other. And I think, for example, alongside PDD or principles for digital development is design thinking, in extension human-centered approach, which is basically a mindset that overlays design thinking and ensure these approaches are not perceived as isolated approaches. So that is also another aspect to it.
That's a good point, Peter. And I think there's a strong linkage between all of these, because in my experience and understanding of design thinking and involving the users of these tools, that in and of itself is empowerment, right? You are taking some of the power away from a proscriptive plan for what development looks like, and moving to this newer wave of digital development where people are active co-designers and what they need to embetter their communities. And I think that's really the disruptive aspect that's underlying a lot of the principles that are out there, is by allowing people to use the tools that already exist, these digital public goods that are out there, and create the world that they'd like to see for themselves, and really entrusting them to make their decisions that locally fill the needs that they have. I think is really important. And a lot of the digital principles that are out there, they don't explicitly say that, Nora, to your point, or Nanjira, to your point. They may not use the language of power dynamics, but surreptitiously they start to disrupt the way things are done, or they can. Nora, I'm curious, to extend on that a little bit from the principles side. Obviously, one of the ideas of the advisory council is to help make these principles, living ideas that change the way we think about things. And the advisory council, I know that right now that they're bringing in a new round of people to extend the group and improve it. What do you think is maybe really the strength of moving the principles toward more of a dynamic, living, breathing set of ideas, a set of philosophies, essentially, about how we do our work together? In the past, it's almost been like a checklist for a lot of people, and it's certainly a good checklist, by at least making sure that you think about these things. You're being more equitable in your work, and you're being more thoughtful in your work. But I feel like everybody's hungry to move beyond that, and really change the way that we think about things from a lens of ethics and power and all the things that we've been talking about. What are you most excited about in terms of the power, the potential of the digital principles to start reframing some of the conversations that people have about how we work together and what our field looks like?
Thanks, Michael. So I think going into the second sort of 2 years sitting on the council and the new council members coming in, I'm really kind of hoping that we'll be able to bring the discussion more to the community and what the principles are. I feel like for the first 2 years, the council being new, I think it was sort of finding its form for a while, and obviously COVID then hitting in the second year obviously also impacted things. Now, and so I think for the past 2 years, we've mainly sort of acted as a sounding board for the DIAL team, and then many of the council members have been involved in sort of testing and providing feedback on resources and guidance that has been developed by the DIAL team. And that's been great. I think a personal highlight for me in terms of the sort of achievements has been some of the self-paced online courses that have been developed, and also these in-person and virtual digital principles 101 trainings. This was really, having these type of resources developed was really important for me getting onto the council in the first place, because I think that, you can't rely on people learning about the principles and practicing the principles by providing them a bunch of PDFs. like you need to make them a little bit more accessible and interactive. So I think these are really great sort of resources coming out of DIAL and the digital principles team in particular over the past 2 years. Now, in terms of how I'd like to sort of see them evolve, and in particular in terms of how we can get the principles to encourage more partnerships and collaborations, what I'd really like to see the new council, as well as sort of DIAL, focus on is strengthening the principles community and discussions on the principles in that community. You know, I mentioned earlier that I really like the principle reuse and improve, and for us to really be able to practice reuse and improve, we need to have that discussion, that community discussion and that sharing. But I was also thinking about, you know, how can we apply the principle of reuse and improve to the digital principles themselves, right? And I think over the past 2 years, there's certainly been a lot of challenges to the principles. You know, people asking are the principles still relevant? Are they anti-racist? Are they anti-colonial? Are they feminist? You know, and should they be revised? Should they be updated? Do we need another principle added? You know, and all of these questions. And I remember in the very first council meeting that we had about 1.5 years ago, we considered some of these questions. They weren't perhaps as pertinent then as I think they are now. And at the time, we kind of concluded that maybe it wasn't the right time to kind of open things up. But instead, the focus has been on developing these additional resources to look at, for example, principles in the context of gender, in the context of sort of other issues. Now, I think maybe now it is the right time to open this up a little bit more and have sort of revive a little bit the principles community and have more discussion and kind of enter these topics in and try to get that discussion going. Is that what do the principles mean? Because ultimately we want them to be living principles and not just kind of like, as you said, ticking the box, but the content of them also needs to be living, even if the title doesn't change. So I'm keen to kind of, you know, speak to the new council members when they start and get that work going to see how can we involve the community in discussing the principles to keep them alive, to keep people practicing them as well, and to keep them relevant.
Now that's exciting to hear, and I think that from conversations I'm hearing, people are really keen to find a venue for these types of conversations, and it seems like the principles are a nice framework, even if they're not directly related to one of the, you know, the 8+ collaboration, the nine principles that are out there. It's a collection of people who are already assembled to talk about these types of issues and how we can do better. So that's something that gives me a lot of hope, and I'm excited to see where things head with the new council coming in here in the next month or two, and to watch more develop. And certainly, you know, from our side, you know, running the Pulse on the Principles podcast, you know, we're excited to help facilitate some of these conversations. Often, asynchronous conversations are great and allow us to go very deep, but it's also nice to have that kind of you know, human dialogue going on. And so we're hoping to bring in some more themes on the podcast over the coming year or two along those lines. But as we look a little bit more to the future, a few more questions for the group, and maybe Peter, I'll start with you about kind of this idea of future vision. There's this fear or this dread that, at least from my perspective, that we're leaving a lot behind when we don't have sufficient levels of kind of country level partners helping to design and influence the way things are going. You know, from your work, what do you see as maybe most what we're missing out on as opportunity cost by having these more prescribed, you know, top-down, you know, global level policies and practice put in place without that real leadership from the, you know, the bottom up at country levels? What are we really leaving behind in terms of opportunities to really make, you know, positive impact on people?
Thanks. I think there are definitely opportunities that we are missing. I think the list would be endless, and definitely. I think one of the things that we are missing out is we are missing to let the partners and local led organization at country level to fall in love with the problems and not solutions. So we are not letting them think deeper, and which would ensure continued innovation around technology solution. So we need to let them, so we lose that aspect. So they sit back. And the other thing is we miss to create an ecosystem of champions in country. If we don't allow that to happen, which by using, for example, what I mentioned, the use of local structures and forums where champions are entrenched, then if we don't have country level partners helping to design and help implementation of technical solutions, then we are missing out on champions that are in country, which could have been identified through such a process. And the list of things that are missed out are endless.
Yeah, it's so important to remember that we often don't know what we don't know, and when we're not involving the right people in those dialogues and discussion and long-term planning, we miss out on untold opportunities, as you said. One thing, a similar issue that has come to my mind that we often leave out maybe less traditional parties, and maybe Nanjira, I'll start with you and then open it up to the others if you have ideas. But I'm thinking of things like the private sector, academics, more local level governments, very close to the ground to people's daily lives, often aren't at the table in terms of planning or strategizing. Do we think that's an important area we want to encourage more collaboration in? And if so, what would be really the major challenges and things that need to shift in terms of the way things are typically done to get those parties to the table in terms of that kind of planning?
Yeah, I'd challenge the assumption the private sector is not on the table. I'd argue they are too much on the table. They have a big chunk of it and that they need to redistribute. I mean, and part of it is coming from this notion, and especially around the SDGs, that, public-private partnerships are going to be key. And yes, no one is challenging the narrative. What I struggle with how the prevailing narrative has taken up, it's almost like it's a zero-sum game. Everybody else is an afterthought. So the civil society, technical communities, academia, media have been sort of like relegated to, we'll think about you when we figure out or when we need you for something, as opposed to what we're calling this multi-stakeholderism, multi-stakeholder approaches, which is supposed to, in essence, give everybody a seat at the table. So the table is already unequally distributed, or in unequal access to it is a challenge. So naturally that progresses. If it's starting at the global level to the local level, that remains a challenge. There are opportunities, though, where, for example, if you're an actor who has gained, your name opens doors as an organization. Why don't you become a responsible ambassador for requiring, whether it's working with a local government, subnational government, to require of them, or just socialize the idea of them consulting with the local communities as well, and not as a tick box measure. And the only way you can actually truly get a sense of whether that's a tick box measure or not is, especially as a global actor who claims to be a global actor, making sure you have the adequate resources to have actually resourced and staffed your organization in the area that it's claiming to work. So these become the political aspects of how we have organizations structured. The biggest excuse I get all the time is we don't have enough resources. I'm like, wait, you could fly 5 people down. Even during COVID, I'm sure it's still happening, to come and sit. So you have this, how this thing goes. I don't have to belabor the point. We need to get creative about the resources we already have. And it's not just financing, it's also about ideas, to Peter's excellent point about not allowing people that creative space. And I think ultimately trust is what is a final determinant. And in a world where there's such a trust deficit, as we all know, we all have a responsibility to make sure we reassess in the work and the work areas and the work streams we're in. In development, especially, we tend to think we're always right. We're on the good side, with the good guys. But even good intentions badly executed can actually lead to harms. So these are the softer issues, if you will, that don't sip into our strategies enough, we don't need to be performing what I call narrative ventriloquism to show that we're with it, we're woke, we're with the program. These are the softer issues that are actually a combination of political and moral responsibility that we need to start addressing. This does not mean we need to start writing digital development principles, the political edition or the moral edition, but these are the things that we should normalize and actually have more spaces where we can call out and speak up to the fact that these need to be the real meat to the bones that we put together in stuff like the principles.
Excellent point. And when you mentioned trust, I'm reminded of the subtle differences between equity and equality. And simply making the table larger and putting additional chairs at the table is often not enough. We have to make sure that we boost the underrepresented voices and help to build that trust by making sure that we're listening to them as much as we're listening to the other voices that may be around the table. So it's not enough just to open the door, but we also need to make sure that we really offer people influence in those conversations and decision making. So it's, very good points. I know we could talk about these topics for hours and hours, but I wanted to give our audience members and our participants an opportunity to bring in some questions to the group as well. So just a reminder, everyone, feel free to use the chat window to the side. If you may need to click on the chat icon in your Microsoft Teams to bring that up, but feel free to drop your questions in there. And I'm going to just quickly look at these, and I think we talked about this briefly, but I'm wondering if any of the panelists here today have advice for dealing with a very practical question of, how can we be collaborative when we're competing for the same funding sources? This is a very practical, frustrating question. At the end of the day, these calls go out, and the money is what it is today, and is often very very prohibitive for us to go out and partner with other people that we're actively competing for resources with. Has anyone seen good patterns or good examples of that happening, even though we are kind of stuck in the status quo for the time being? Are there areas that we can kind of nudge in terms of collaboration within that framework that we're living within right now?
I want to complicate that and say we shouldn't rush to a solution, because the real truth is we can't. We can perform attempts, we can have strategies to try and be collaborative, but we need to sit with the discomfort of the fact that we are being pitted to compete against one another. And it takes so many varieties. Maybe we need to start talking to that conversation more. As some uni graduates in Amsterdam want to come and set up, I don't know, a school with digital education, ed tech tools in Kenya. A local person from that community wants to do the same thing. They go to a funder of any kind, who's more likely to get the resources, one. And let's even assume they both get the resources. Typically, like I was saying earlier, operationally, we are not usually giving support, whether it's financial resources or otherwise, for these mechanisms of collaboration to happen. So this does need to be allowed the room to blossom as a complicated conversation that needs to happen, because I'm not convinced we can just say it's, oh yeah, this one example that I've seen in a certain world of work isn't necessarily applicable. These are the tensions that we need to sit a lot more with and start pushing back where we can to those who are shaping the instruments, whether it's financing or other. But I want to say, can we leave the question as it is, because it's true, it's not easy. We're not going to solve it overnight or during this conversation.
No, that's valuable to remember. We can't necessarily solve all the problems ourselves, but we have to live within the constraints that we have. And like you say, there's steps that we can start changing to change the reality that we're living in. But for now, acknowledging the current situation, I think, is important. And so just sitting with that reality is important to remember and not get too frustrated with ourselves. Many of us are optimists and would like to change the world much faster than we can, but understanding that large systemic change takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, a lot of nudging of the systems that are in place. That's a good point. Another good question from Shelley, one of our attendees, talking about really highlighting why it's important to remember one of the principles is about using open source, specifically open source software. And Shelley points out that very accurately that there are often a lot of hidden costs there. There's time and human resources required to get them up and running, and that often seems to offset what we might be able to do by going it alone. And she also rightly, I think, points out that there are some alternatives that we can start thinking about as in terms of software as a service, cheaper ways to get access to the technology that are out there. When I say cheaper, I mean meaning more cost-effective ways to do that. Obviously, the UN Secretary General has been pushing a lot for this idea of digital public goods, and I think that that's really challenging the way that we think in terms of what software and what technology can look like. It need not necessarily be something that we download and install and run ourselves, but thinking about open source software and open source solutions as a public good that we collectively maintain, for the good of all of us. I'm wondering if any of you have had either experiences with, running up against those hidden costs, or ideas about alternatives, to reduce the burden of maintaining this idea of digital public goods and helping to strengthen them, but also make them more effective for organizations to take advantage of. Peter, in your work in Kenya, have you run across this happening where I know some implementations of different software platforms have been out there, and the need for kind of customization and specific needs at the country level didn't always match up against the needs of the software designers, right, of these platforms. Also, oftentimes it's an opportunity for implementers and technologists at the local level to offer their services and to become part of the solution. Do you see that as something that could eventually scale up beyond just at the country level, where you have implementation work being able to be those customizations and those strategies being able to be reused more broadly to help reduce that total cost of ownership?
I think there is a wider debate around that area and many aspects to be considered, but I totally agree with the issues raised about open source. But maybe to comment something else around that area is some lack of clarity when we look at the principle of open source and the principle of secure and privacy, and where most of the people tend to confuse the two principles, and they are seen to be like pushing away from each other, where most people think that open source means insecure. So there's a lot of dynamics around open source and security and other related principles. But yes, I agree with what has been raised.
There's an interesting tension.
We had a similar comment from Sebastian, I think, in reminding us that a lot of these concepts can be combined. So you can have software as a service-based open source solutions. You can have, Peter, as you mentioned, you need not have insecure software just because it's open source. You have to really combine all of these principles. And if you're actually building technology solutions, you need to make sure that you're not just doing open source to do open source. You need to make sure that you have these other systems and the other strategies in place. For example, sustainability. Designing for sustainability, where that meets open source, you have an issue that one of our questioners, and I apologize, maybe it was Shelley or someone else, mentioned that you often end up with open source software that is kind of neglected after the first year or so of development, or you've had that first implementation and then the software kind of sits and gets dusty, for all time, because there aren't those funding mechanisms to go into the long-term sustainability or the maintenance. I know a few of you mentioned that earlier as well. Part of that is about changing the conversations around how funding works, and these are big, difficult challenges. Do you see opportunities for making more obvious the areas of partnership? And I know some of you mentioned this problem of kind of reinventing the wheel, coming up with lots of new solutions every time, lots of new innovations every time. Have we seen any good examples of where people have gone back to an existing solution and built upon that? Is that something that we can start to replicate and see more often? And are there patterns, that people can follow to do more of that?
It's funny. The first example coming to mind for me is all the rush to create contact tracing apps in the heydays of the pandemic. And where even in California, home of Silicon Valley and all that, what worked in the end was the tried and tested manual contacting approach. So we hype sometimes, you get so caught up in digital is a solution. And this was such a cathartic moment to say we cannot always keep short-circuiting the tried and tested ways, or the ways to naturally adapt to a point where you can have a hybrid, the best possible hybrid. And that's a really good instructive example during this time that sometimes when you go back to what works, it may not even have the digital as we think of it, or the digital is still pen and paper. And the humility to accept that and to even inject that into our strategies, the adaptability and adaptiveness of our strategies is something we absolutely have to keep in mind.
Maybe that's a good example of a new principle, or extending the principles to add that humility, be humble as part of that, or maybe that's principle 0 in many cases. It's a really good point. And as a geek by education, it's a difficult one for me to grapple with, but I'm taking notes with pen and paper right now, and sometimes that is the best solution and fastest depending on the situation. And a good point, to your COVID contact tracing apps example, Nanjira. I actually live in the U.S. I live the state just immediately north of California, who were involved in this open source platform. That the idea was for people to reuse and improve and build upon this single platform. But our state has yet to even implement that, even though they're actually using the same code. They're caught up in their own internal bureaucracy. And so simply building something open source or building, planning to reuse and improve something is often not enough to actually get the job done. And it's important to realize you have to really think holistically about all of these issues together. And things like designing with the user, will understand that, hey, this is not something that people are actually going to uptake and start using anyway. When you bring all of those principles in together, then you can start to get a complete picture of how things will go.
And to just quickly add, I think it's just that also when it comes to scale, to the question of replication and success, these are deeply political issues, to your example. If governance or government mechanisms or decision-making mechanisms are not streamlined, it will be very difficult to get the local government or whether it's subnational, whatever actor who's in charge of that place to necessarily adopt what worked in another area, and especially if they're in competition with one another for another thing. And this is where you see product and policy needing to move in lockstep, especially at this nexus where we talk about scale and sustainability. That's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, good points. Nora?
Yeah, just a very basic point that I think is kind of worth remembering when we're talking about the principles is that they are not a tick in the box exercise. They're not prescriptive as such. They're sort of living guidelines, and there are tensions between them as well. So you can't sort of go and, okay, achieve this and this and this and this, and now I'm good, right? And so when it comes to questions of open source and concerns about that, I've always looked at the principles more as these are guidelines, like look at what good practice could look like, and then you need to look at the realities of your particular context, of your particular situation as well, and do what you can, right? It's not about, okay, did that, and I just don't think it's helpful to think about the principles that way. And I think it does deserve sort of reiterating, because sometimes people do forget.
Yeah, very good point.
Just adding quickly on what Nora has mentioned, I think there's a very interesting comment from Acharya on the chat, and I think answers most of that. And I think looking at the principles, it could be a bit frustrating looking at them, like Nora has mentioned, like check boxes. You need to move from number 1 to number 9 and ensure that you have done them. They are not a project. They are a guide to what you are doing. So I think it's And most of these principles are actually, you might realize that using other approaches, you are already adhering to them in your project. It's only that consciously you are not calling them by names. So I don't think it need to be frustrating, like these principles are very hard to implement, or these principles, because they are not projects by themselves, but they are guidelines to what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think, well, we can obviously continue this conversation, as I said, for hours and hours. And I'm hoping I'll ask Claude to provide the link into the chat where we're actually going to set up a space on the Digital Principles Forum for people to continue this conversation, because there are some questions we weren't able to get to, a lot of good points that people were raising in the chat, and I think there are ideas about what that roadmap looks like to start living the principles essentially in your work. It's not something you need to do all at once, so you have to fear of doing perfectly. There are strategies you can use to start to integrate them. So with that on our mind, I'll ask one kind of quick, rapid last question to each of the three of you, and I'll ask you all the same question, and that is basically, what one either tip or piece of advice, a practical piece of advice, would you give the attendees here today that are really interested in increasing partnerships, increasing collaboration? What one factor, what one strategy would you recommend to them to start weaving collaboration and partnership into their daily work? Peter, I'll start with you. Or you can pass. Maybe your video is frozen, it looks like. So Nora, maybe I'll defer to you while Peter gets restored.
Yes, I think my advice would probably be to know what your strengths are. So as an organization, and play to them, and then seek partners to do what you don't do as well, and not try to do it all yourself. I think that's the way to really build partnerships, to play to your strengths and let others play to theirs.
Knowing we can't do everything ourselves, knowing our limitations. Again, that goes back to that be humble principle that I guess. Nanjira, over to you. One practical bit of advice you'd give and leave people with for today.
Yeah, I mean, really, the work that will go into being collaborative is something that might not even fit the metrics of measuring success, because it's a labor of love, of finding conversations with the right people, establishing trust between actors and stakeholders. In my experience, it's a lot of the stuff you cannot put into metrics and strategies neatly. Affordance of time and energy is so important to be able to do that, but it's so necessary as the building block, and it outlasts in ways that are so important. Lastly, that the things I'm alluding to are really interpersonal, and it's really about making sure you can allow for the personal to inform the institutional and outlive the person who did that. So that loop is what I found is a tried and tested way of making sure we can find ways to be collaborative, and especially even in an environment where resources are scarce and we often may be pitted in competition for that.
Great, thank you. And Peter, I think you may be back with us. Let us know if you can hear us. I see you're having some connection issues, so if not, that's okay. We're very grateful for your participation and for everyone's participation. I would just add one item to that list of advice. Think about leaving your legacy, beyond your individual work, not only for the organization, thinking how you can influence your own organization and team that you're working with, but how you can help that organization, make a small dent in the way things are done. And this goes back again to what Nora said, is that, it's going to take all of us to really achieve the level of changes we'd like to see in the world, and finding our one small thing that we can make a change to. That can add up to everyone else's work together. And obviously that involves collaboration, that involves ongoing communication. So Claude has the link there. We really encourage you all to join the conversation. Following up from this, we'll be listing the discussion questions we had here today, providing the notes and the video access for people who may have missed the conversation. And we'd like to keep that going. We'd like to hear your further ideas for increasing collaboration across all of the principles. So with that, thank you all for joining us. A special thanks to Nora, Nanjira, and Peter for participating in our panel today. And most of all, thank you all for participating and listening and adding your ideas, not only today, but in the future. And that wraps up our hour. Hope to see you all again in the closing sessions later. And thank you again. We appreciate it. Thank you, Peter. Take care, everyone. Be well.